Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we are taking on a really profound analysis of human motivation.
We are.
But we're shifting the entire frame. We're not looking at this through a moral lens, asking what's good or bad.
No, this is all about system architecture.
Exactly. Our mission today is to decode the stack of sources we've got, clinical data, research notes, that give us a technical breakdown of the human reward system.
Right. We're treating the brain as, well, the most sophisticated biological operating system ever devised. And our sources are like the internal documentation.
A source code.
The source code, exactly. How does that system allocate resources? How does it maintain balance? It's far more mechanical than most of us realize.
And the high-level concept we're trying to debug today is altruism. We're not looking at it as just, simple kindness. We're framing it as a critical, high-level resource allocation protocol.
A piece of core legacy code.
A very old piece of code designed for species propagation. And if that's true, if cooperation is so essential, then we have to face this massive paradox.
The one we see all around us.
Why is this system failing so spectacularly right now in this modern ecosystem of hyperabundance? Why is isolation and compulsive self-destructive behavior just skyrocketing?
That paradox, that glitch in the matrix, is really the core of our analysis today.
So where do we start?
We have to focus on the fundamental neurobiological algorithms. I mean, at its core, this whole system runs on one chemical currency of motivation. Dopamine. And we're going to examine how the sheer abundance of modern stimuli manipulates that currency, leading to a total system failure.
A failure that manifests as isolation and what the sources call anhedonia.
Yes. The inherent breakdown of our social connectivity code.
Okay, let's really unpack this. Before we can even talk about the malware, we have to understand the system specs.
We need to know what we're working with.
So phase one, the system specs, the core algorithm.
Right.
Our sources, they lay out this foundational architecture of the human reward system.
Right.
And it's built on a principle of self-regulation, where pleasure and pain, they aren't separate things. They're opposing variables in the same operating system.
Which is such a counterintuitive idea for most people.
It is?
We think of them as totally different experiences, but neurologically, they're deeply intertwined.
So let's start with the currency itself, dopamine.
Dopamine. It is, fundamentally, the universal currency the brain uses to measure the value of anything.
Not pleasure itself, but value.
Exactly. It's the Resource Allocation Protocol. If something releases dopamine, the brain tags it as important. It says, hey, pay attention to this. This is worth getting again.
And the rule of this currency is, well, it's frighteningly simple.
It is.
The addictive potential is just dictated by the sheer concentration of dopamine released. And this is key, the speed of that release.
The velocity. How fast that system gets flooded determines how quickly it breaks.
And when you look at the data comparing natural rewards to modern engineered ones, I mean, the scale is just staggering.
It really puts the problem into perspective. A natural reward, let's say a good meal or sex, that gives you a dopamine release we can call a baseline, 100% activity.
The biological equilibrium we evolved for.
Right. But then you look at the engineered stuff, nicotine hits you at 150%.
Already a huge jump.
A huge jump. Cocaine accelerates that to 225%, and then amphetamine.
This is where it just gets, it's off the charts.
It completely breaks the system. It blasts that pathway with dopamine at 1,000% above the baseline. 1,000.
We're not talking about like a marginal improvement on pleasure. This is an order of magnitude overload.
It's an evolutionary mismatch on a colossal scale. Our hardware, which was designed for a world of scarcity, it just cannot handle this chemical fire hose.
So to understand how it breaks, we need to map the circuit. Where does this currency flow?
Okay, so there are three main components in this critical circuit. First, you've got the ventral tegmental area, the VTA.
That's the fact.
That's the dopamine factory, yeah. It's where it's made. Then, the VTA sends those signals to the nucleus accumbens.
And that's what, the central processor.
You can think of it that way. It's the central processing unit for motivation. It gets the signal and translates that chemical message into drive, into I want.
And then connecting all that is the prefrontal cortex, the PFC.
The CEO of the brain.
Right, the part that's supposed to be in charge. Long-term planning, impulse control.
All the executive functions. And this whole circuit, the mesolimbic pathway, it doesn't really manage pleasure itself. That's more opioids and serotonin. This pathway manages the seeking.
The anticipation.
The drive, the craving for the reward, and that high dopamine currency guarantees that the seeking behavior gets prioritized over everything else.
So the CEO gets overridden.
The CEO gets a frantic, screaming memo from the nucleus accumbens that it just can't ignore.
Which brings us to the core mechanism, this pleasure-pain balance.
Yes, the opponent process mechanism. This is so fundamental to understanding addiction.
It's fascinating that neuroscientists found they're not processed in different places. Pleasure and pain live in overlapping brain regions.
And they function like a seesaw or a balance. Always trying to get back to level, back to homeostasis.
So let's visualize that scale. It's perfectly balanced.
Right.
Then you introduce a pleasure stimulus.
Yeah.
A notification on your phone, a bite of a cookie, a drug.
And dopamine flows. The balance tips hard to the side of pleasure.
But the system immediately sees that as a threat to its stability.
It's a deviation from the norm, and the operating system's prime directive is to maintain that norm.
And this is where the gremlins come in.
That's the analogy the sources use, and it's a great one. These powerful, unconscious, self-regulating mechanisms, their only job is to restore balance.
So they jump on the other side.
They immediately hop on the pain side of the balance to counteract that rush of pleasure.
And this isn't a conscious choice.
No, not at all. This is a deep biological failsafe. It's the operating system running a background correction protocol. The moment pleasure tips the scale, the counterforce is already on its way.
Which leads to the cost of that deviation.
What Solomon and Corbett called the opponent process theory.
And the cost is that those gremlins, they don't just jump off once the drug wears off.
No, they linger. And because they linger, the balance doesn't just return to neutral, it keeps moving.
It overshoots.
It overshoots, tipping an equal and opposite amount to the side of pain.
And that feeling, that state,
Yeah.
that's the after reaction.
That is the neurological definition of a craving. That dip you feel after the high is gone. That irritability, that anxiety, that overwhelming urge to do it again.
That's the balance tip to the side of pain.
Yes, and your system is now screaming for another reward hit. Not even for pleasure anymore, but just to get back to level. Just to feel normal.
So the drive isn't for joy. It's to escape the pain that was created by the last search for joy.
It's a perfect self-perpetuating loop, a vicious cycle.
Now, the system is designed to handle this occasionally.
Right, with natural rewards, it works fine.
But when the stimulus is constant, predictable, and way more potent than anything in nature,
The system enters failure mode, and that failure mode is called tolerance or neuroadaptation.
and the effects are cumulative. First, that initial pleasure hit you're chasing, it gets weaker and shorter.
Your system gets ruthlessly efficient at neutralizing the dopamine flood.
And second, this is the insidious part, the after response of pain gets stronger, and it lasts longer.
The gremlins get more numerous, they're stronger, they're faster, and they start to just camp out on the pain side of the balance.
So your baseline, your hedonic set point, actually resets, it shifts downward.
Permanently.
I found that anecdote in the sources about romance novels so telling. It's such a trivial example, but it illustrates it perfectly.
Oh, the progression.
Yeah. It starts with something relatively tame, a low dopamine story like Twilight, a modest tip of the balance.
Right.
But the system adapts so quickly. Soon, that's not enough. The reader needs more potency. They move to more graphic, more formulaic content.
Just searching for the fix.
Just for the fix. They're skipping the plot, ignoring character, just racing to the climax until even the most extreme stuff barely registers.
That's neuroadaptation in a nutshell, demanding more and more potency for a smaller and smaller return.
And the long-term consequence of this is that the pleasure-pain balance becomes permanently weighted to the side of pain.
The brain is trying to protect itself. It's a defensive measure. It starts reducing the number of available dopamine receptors, a process called downregulation.
Which leads to the core pathology here, the dopamine deficit state.
And we have stunning visual proof of this from Dr. Nora Volko's brain imaging studies.
The images they're just stark.
They're unequivocal. In a healthy brain, the reward centers light up, bright red, vigorous dopamine activity.
But in the brain of someone with a substance use disorder, even after weeks of abstinence,
it's dark. That whole area is functionally silent. The cells are there, but the receptors have been pulled offline. As the source says, Team Dopamine took their ball and went home.
and that leads to the ultimate devastating paradox of it all. Hedonism, the relentless pursuit of pleasure for its own sake.
Inevitably leads to anhedonia, the inability to enjoy pleasure of any kind.
You burn out the very machinery you need to feel good.
And once that system is burned out, you're left in the state of chronic suffering. And that's what drives relapse. It's not about finding pleasure anymore.
The system can't even process pleasure.
Exactly. It's about a desperate, panicked attempt to just alleviate the pain of that deficit state. To get back to a normal that keeps moving further and further away.
So the pursuit of happiness becomes the literal sabotage of the mechanism for happiness.
Precisely.
Which means we have to look at the environment that is so expertly exploiting this vulnerability.
The malware.
The malware. Let's get into phase 2. The malware in the system collapse. So if the opponent process balance is the architecture, the modern world is the environment it's running in. And the problem isn't just internal, it's an external stressor.
The world itself has become the malware.
Yes. It's driving this massive system overload.
And our brains are just tragically mismatched to this environment we've built. I love the quote from the researcher.
We are cacti in the rainforest.
We are cacti in the rainforest. We evolved for scarcity, for a world where rewards were rare, unpredictable, and required a lot of effort.
And now we live in a world of overwhelming instantaneous abundance,
which our system is just not equipped to handle.
And the sources are clear. The single biggest risk factor for addiction is easy access.
It's all about access. And this is driven by what the historian David Courtwright called limbic capitalism.
Which is the systematic engineering of products to be more potent and more available.
It's maximizing profit by maximizing compulsion. And you can trace this throughout history.
The cigarette rolling machine in the 1880s, it went from 4 cigarettes a minute to 20,000.
Just flooding the market, creating a supply that then creates its own demand.
And the chemical escalation is even more obvious. Morphine is 10 times more potent than opium.
Then heroin, which was marketed as a less addictive alternative,
unbelievable,
turns out to be 2 to 5 times more potent than morphine.
And the trend just keeps going up. Modern cannabis concentrates are 5-10 times stronger than what was around in the 60s.
The baseline of potency is always escalating.
And then technology came along and just put this whole process on hyperdrive.
It created what we can only call digital drugs.
And the anecdote about Jacob the engineer, it just perfectly illustrates the difference in access velocity.
It really does. As a young man, to get his fix, he had to build this bizarre, elaborate machine with a record player and a metal coil.
Right. It took effort, planning, resources. There was friction built into the system.
That friction was a natural self-binding mechanism. But then later in life, he moves to Germany, he's managing his life.
And then 1995 happens.
The internet arrives, and the collapse was total and immediate.
He describes how the instantaneous, potent access to online pornography just shattered all of his control.
He stays up all night in a hotel room, misses a major conference, almost loses his career.
That transition from needing to physically build a machine to just clicking a link.
That's it. That's the removal of all friction, and that's what overrides our controls. We're all living in a world of digital masturbation machines now.
Even something as benign as online shopping.
Oh yeah, the anticipation high of ordering, the dopamine rush when the package arrives.
And then it's gone. Instantly.
So you have to order something else, something cheaper, faster, just to keep the loop going. Limbic capitalism's entire goal is to make rewards instant and hyper-potent.
But the most dangerous consequence of this isn't just personal, it's social.
It's the impairment of our social operating system.
High dopamine consumption is, at its core, the antithesis of human connection.
It has to be. The potent, easy reward from the drug or the behavior will always, always outcompete the complex, slower, lower potency rewards of a real relationship.
It creates isolation by design.
Which brings us back to our core question, the catastrophic failure of the altruism algorithm.
And the experimental proof for this is, well, it's chilling.
The rat experiment.
The rat experiment.
Yeah.
So the control setup, you have a free rat and a trapped rat in a little plastic bottle.
Right. And what does the free rat do?
It instinctively works, sometimes for a long time, to free its trapped peer.
That's the legacy code. Mutual cooperation for species survival.
But then they change one variable. They let the free rat self-administer heroin.
They expose it to the high dopamine consumption that triggers neuroadaptation.
And the result is a perfect illustration of a total system failure.
The addicted rat becomes completely indifferent to the trapped one.
It's too engrossed in the opioid haze to care about its fellow rat. The social signal, the distress of its peer, it's just drowned out.
It is. The chemical noise is too loud.
That insight it's maybe the most profound thing in this entire deep dive.
I agree.
High dopamine consumption is a neurological denial of service attack on our social connectivity centers.
That's a perfect way to put it. It's a DOS attack on empathy. The overwhelming signal from the drug isolates the user. It overrides that ancient code for cooperation.
The system, now running in this chemically driven survival mode, just deprioritizes altruism.
It has to. The immediate potent reward is chosen over the complex, long-term social one, every single time.
And beyond the collapse of empathy, there are other system side effects.
Yes, like the impairment of our ability to plan for the future, what's known as delay discounting.
High dopamine goods just mess with our prefrontal cortex's ability to wait for a reward.
We start to drastically overvalue the immediate present.
And the clinical data on this is just alarming.
It really is. When researchers asked active heroin and amphetamine users if they'd take less money now versus more money later,
20% took the immediate smaller reward.
20%, compared to only 2% of healthy controls. For someone in that state, the future has almost no value. Only right now matters.
And the implication is at the temporal horizon. It just shrinks.
Dramatically. When researchers asked opioid-addicted participants to write a story about their future,
The stories average 9 days long.
9 days.
9 days, compared to healthy controls, whose futures averaged almost 5 years long.
And if your future is only a week long, how can you possibly plan for anything? A relationship, a career.
Altruism becomes neurologically impossible. You can't sacrifice today for a tomorrow that doesn't feel real.
And this short-term focus, combined with the isolation, it leads to this profound loss of self.
The false self that Winnicott talked about,
A projected identity that has nothing to do with your lived reality.
like the patient Tony in the sources. He's curating this perfect, ambitious life on Facebook.
While in reality, he's isolated and suicidal.
And when your lived experience is so divorced from your projected image, it creates this feeling of derealization, of being fake.
And if you don't feel real, then what's the consequence of ending it all? It loses its gravity.
It's a devastating diagnosis.
It is.
But the sources also provide a path forward. The recovery protocols.
The debugging process.
Phase 3, debugging the system. So, given this catastrophic failure, how do we even begin to fix it?
How do we reset that pleasure-pain balance and restore our ability to connect?
The first step is non-negotiable.
A forced reboot. A dopamine fast.
Abstinence is the prerequisite for homeostasis. You have to give the brain time for those gremlins to dismount and for the balance to level out.
You cannot reason with a brain that's in a dopamine deficit state. It's not possible.
And the timeline for this reboot, it's longer than people think.
Much longer. Dr. Volkow's data showed that even after 2 weeks, dopamine transmission was still way below normal.
But 4 weeks, that seems to be the critical threshold.
At 4 weeks, you start to see major symptomatic improvement because the brain has had enough time to start re-expressing those receptors.
And the clinical outcomes back this up.
Oh, completely.
Yeah.
The alcohol study where men with clinical depression were treated with just 1 month of sobriety.
No other treatment.
No other treatment. And after 4 weeks, 80% of them no longer met the criteria for depression.
Which suggests that depression wasn't a separate issue.
It was a symptom of the dopamine deficit state. The system just needed the toxic input removed so it could reset itself.
But once you start that reboot, you have to reinforce the system. Willpower isn't enough.
Willpower is a finite resource. It fatigues. You need firewalls.
This is the protocol of self-binding, creating tangible barriers between desire and action.
It's the pause button. And it starts with physical strategies, creating space.
It's Odysseus tying himself to the mast. He knew he couldn't rely on willpower alone.
So you unplug the TV, you put your phone in a K-safe timer, you create real physical distance.
There's a crucial warning here.
Yes, this is not fail-safe.
The story of Oscar, the elderly man whose wife locked his wine in a file cabinet.
It's a perfect cautionary tale. The compulsion was so strong that the barrier itself became part of the game.
A challenge that actually enhanced the craving.
And he used long stem pliers and a plastic straw to get the wine out. He solved the puzzle.
Which shows that for severe compulsion, you need more than just a physical lock.
That's why you also need chronological strategies, time limits.
Restricting consumption to very narrow windows.
The rat studies on cocaine are so clear on this. 6 hours of access, and they use until they collapse.
But 1 hour of access.
And their use stays steady. It doesn't escalate into that compulsive spiral. The time limit itself provides the necessary friction.
Okay, so after abstinence and binding, we get to the really counterintuitive.
We're deliberately seeking discomfort.
Instead of pushing on the pleasure side, we intentionally press on the pain side.
And we leverage that opponent process mechanism in reverse. The initial self-imposed pain triggers the homeostatic response.
But this time, the gremlins jump on the pleasure side of the balance.
And the result is what we're calling adaptive dopamine, a more sustainable, internally generated pleasure.
The cold water immersion data here is just incredible.
It is. Submerging men in 57-degree water.
Not even that cold, really.
Not freezing, no, but uncomfortable. And it increased their plasma dopamine by 250%.
And norepinephrine by over 500%.
And crucially, that effect lasted for hours after they got out of the water. It's a clean, sustained energy, not the spike and crash of a drug.
This is the principle of hormesis.
Yes. The idea that moderate self-imposed stress actually improves the system's functionality. It's the optimal load.
We see it everywhere in biology.
Too much pain is bad, but just the right amount is beneficial.
Like the worms exposed to heat. 2 hours of heat and they live longer and were more resilient.
4 hours of heat and it reduced their lifespan. It's all about finding that sweet spot of productive stress.
And exercise is the most accessible form of this.
It's the most profound drug in this category. It's technically toxic to your cells on a micro level.
But it's overwhelmingly health promoting. It boosts dopamine, serotonin, and even neurogenesis, the birth of new brain cells.
And it builds incredible resistance to addiction. Rats with running wheels use cocaine less.
But there is a caveat here.
Always. You can overdo this too. Extreme endurance sports can become their own compulsion, leading to overtraining syndrome and anhedonia again.
The goal is always balance.
Always.
So we've reset the chemical balance. Now we have to fix the social damage.
We have to counter that DOS attack on our social network.
And the protocol for that is radical honesty.
It's the core of every major ethical framework, and it's critical for recovery.
Because it works on so many levels. It fosters real connection, it promotes self-awareness.
And neurobiologically, there's a strong hypothesis that practicing honesty literally strengthens the neural circuits for it. What fires together, wires together.
You're training your brain to be more aware, more connected.
And it helps you rewrite your own story.
The narrative element, yes. The sources say that patients who stay unwell are always the victim in their own stories.
They cling to that narrative because it's comfortable, but it leaves them powerless.
And recovery is about mapping that story and rerouting it, taking responsibility for your reactions.
It transforms helplessness into agency.
I found the insight on resentment so powerful, shifting focus from what others did to me to my own contribution. It's freeing.
And this kind of truth-telling is contagious. It creates a collective plenty mindset.
Right. The modified marshmallow experiment.
Exactly. The kids who dealt with a reliable researcher who kept her promise, they were able to wait 4 times longer for the reward.
Because they trusted the system. They trusted the network. Honesty builds the social glue that allows for long-term planning.
Which brings us to the role of the group and shame.
And we have to distinguish between 2 types of shame.
Yes. Destructive shame versus pro-social shame.
Destructive shame is the cycle. You overconsume, you feel shame, you hide it, you become more isolated.
Which leads to more consumption. The patient Lori, whose church told her not to talk about her struggles, that was destructive shame.
The community failed her.
But the pro-social shame cycle is the opposite. It's the model used by groups like AA.
You overconsume, you feel shame.
But you immediately meet that with radical honesty in a group that accepts you, and then you take action to make amends.
And the result is belonging and decreased consumption.
And the reason these strict groups work so well can be explained by Iannacone's theory of sacrifice and stigma.
The strict rules, the high demands.
They act as a high cost of entry. It ferrets out the free riders, the people who aren't truly committed.
So it strengthens the core network for those who stay.
Exactly. It maximizes the utility of the group.
And this commitment, this hard-won honesty and belonging, it leads to the ultimate reward.
The intimacy
A
explodes.
flood of adaptive, rejuvenating dopamine and oxytocin from real human connection.
It is the direct neurochemical opposite of the isolating high of a drug. It's the system finally prioritizing real connection over the chemical shortcut.
So let's try to synthesize all of this.
Okay.
We started by framing altruism as a resource allocation protocol, as legacy code for survival.
And we found that the modern hyperabundant environment acts as malware.
It triggers a hedonic reset that breaks our social algorithm, leading to isolation and anhedonia, a total system failure.
And recovery is not a moral quest. It is a biological restoration project.
It requires a forced reboot, intentionally seeking discomfort to generate clean, adaptive dopamine.
And most critically, seeking truth through radical honesty to restore our network connectivity.
The final lesson from this pleasure-pain balance, it seems, isn't to run away from the world.
No, it's to immerse yourself more fully in it.
I loved that final anecdote about the patient Mohammed, who found his escape not in a drug, but in just focusing his camera lens on a tiny beetle.
He found a world in that moment that was more compelling than any drug-induced state, a world that required no drug at all.
That's the path forward, finding deep rewards by engaging with reality, with all its inherent friction and effort.
And that means we have to remember the core lessons, that the relentless pursuit of pleasure leads to pain, that recovery begins with abstinence, with self-binding, with pressing on the pain side.
So the final provocation for you, the listener, is this. How will you intentionally structure friction back into your life? Physical, chronological, social, to protect your own operating system and to restore your capacity for simple, sustained joy. We hope this deep dive has illuminated the hidden mechanics of your own motivation.